Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming along and listening to this talk. And it is quite a niche area, isn't it? The application of cognitive science in the teaching of economics. But whether you teach economics or whether you teach another subject, I really hope you're going to find that this presentation is useful and interesting. And it is coming from a classroom practitioner perspective. Everything in this presentation I have tried and tested in my own classroom. Some things, of course, didn't make the cut, but everything in here is what I am using day to day with my own classes because I believe that it works. I've been heavily inspired by the work of the learning scientists. So you'll notice, and particularly if you have encountered their excellent book, Understanding How We Learn, you will find that I'm referring to the 6 key strategies in there that they recommend, obviously based on the research in the field of cognitive science, cognitive psychology. So I am kind of using that as my basis, and I've got references to a few other bits of research and theory that I've encountered and applied along the way as well. Okay, so we should get started. All right, so the first area is retrieval practice. And I should imagine you have heard about this already. And I'm just going to give you one very small insight into the theory behind this, and then go on to look more at the applied practice. This really has been, a key thing that's had a huge impact on my ability to help improve my students' memory and to improve their learning and their performance in my subject. And I'm just going to read you a little section actually from the book that I've been referring to, because this had a real impact on me, this particular couple of paragraphs. So it says here, early on, before cognitive psychologists started researching the processes involved, memory was often described with a library analogy. This is the idea that memories are put down in our minds as though they were written down in books and stored away neatly in organised locations. If we wanted to retrieve a memory, we would go down the relevant aisle and select the appropriate book. If we can't quite retrieve the memory, the words printed in the books may have faded with time. If we can't find the memory at a specified location, perhaps it was like a library book getting misplaced. But many studies have shown this is not at all the way memory functions. We don't lay down objective, definitive memory traces that are later retrieved verbatim. Instead, memory is reconstructive. This is a key concept in long-term memory, the idea that every time you retrieve a memory, you are actually changing it. And that just blew my mind when I read that. The idea that when you are thinking about something, okay, so maybe you have encountered this picture of a bee, and then you want to try later on to retrieve that, to recall that memory again, you have to rebuild that memory from scratch. Okay, so you reconstruct that picture again in your mind. And every time you try to bring that again to memory, you're reconstructing it again from scratch. And sometimes it comes out a little bit closer and sometimes less so. Okay, but it's that reconstructive idea. And to me, that was really powerful about the reason why you want to get students bringing information to mind. And that really sort of is something I tell my students as well. We want to obviously get better at remembering things by continuing to bring information to mind regularly to make sure it's more and more accurate and close to what we actually want to learn and to remember. Okay, so this is how I go about doing it. At the start of each of my lessons, I tend to do 10 minutes of mini whiteboard practice, and I'm going to show you in a minute the sorts of things that I do. And then I repeat practice on topics on many, many occasions. Now, it doesn't have to be 10 minutes, of course. You can do this however works, but this works for my classes, and it's a good sort of classroom habit. I've been doing this in all my classes, whether they be remote or in person, certainly for the last couple of years. And it really makes a huge difference, actually, to what students can remember, even just by coming to the class, even if they haven't done that much revision outside of the lesson. When I say here many occasions, I really do mean that. And I think it's particularly important for economics. You think you've taught something and you think students have taken it on board, but you have to go many, many times. Yeah, it's sometimes suggested in books, go back to things about 3 times. I think for economics, it's probably more, revisiting things multiple occasions so students are able to recall them correctly. Yeah, I really do mean many, many times. Okay, so what does this look like? These are the sorts of things that I typically am getting students to bring to mind from memory. Okay, so that list there is the things that I'm typically including in my retrieval practice, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. And I don't go out creating specific retrieval practice resources. Most of my retrieval practice resources are created, in snatched minutes here and there. So I'm teaching a lesson, and then I would basically go away at the end, take a quick photo of what's on the board or screenshot what I've been using, or maybe quickly type something up and paste it into a PowerPoint presentation. Then add just a very simple question or a very simple task. Something like, what is this? Or write down everything you can remember about this, or a very brief question. Okay, and then in future lessons, I just replay that PowerPoint presentation on whichever slide I want to with the question, give students a few minutes and then the answer. And also make that presentation available to them for self-quizzing. And it looks something like this. Okay, so you can see there. An example. That's just, of course, from the very start of the course. There's a few more of these, of course. You can see this is slide 91 slides in this PowerPoint presentation. Okay, but I simply am just taking content. Can you see how sometimes I'm building up with reminders as well? Okay, so, I'm going to give more clues at the beginning when I do this the first few times, fewer clues as it goes on later. But I'm basically just displaying these question slides, then display the answer. And my students would recognise this, okay, because they see this many, many times. Okay, different ones at different points. All right, sometimes diagrams, lists, content. And it's just stuff that I've, created really quickly. Okay, you can see here screenshots of sort of lesson PowerPoints and bits of the specification or pictures of diagrams, okay, and just brief questioning related to them. Okay, so that's sort of how I go about doing that for the subject. And then making this available as well. So I store my documents on Google Drive for students, and I've got little guides that have definition lists with blank spaces in, and then lists of diagrams that they need to learn, and then they can go into the answers folder and pick out the definition list or pick out the diagram and check if it was correct. And again, I'm encouraging students to go away and do this regularly themselves, okay? And they know that this is a very, very important homework to be done for the subject. And the same thing for tests as well. I often give students sort of retrieval practice activities, I call them that, prior to sort of actual formal assessments, with very much the same format, testing almost exactly the same content. So when they go into the test, they've already had plenty of opportunity at recalling that same information. Okay. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk quickly about is dual coding. Okay, and this is the idea that we're receiving information through 2 channels. So we're seeing things and we're hearing things. So that's the dual kind of idea. So if I present this picture and I say B, okay, you are receiving that information in 2 ways. You are seeing the picture of the bee, it's going in your eye, okay, and you are hearing the word bee through your ear, all right, and you're getting both of those 2 ways of the information coming to you, okay, and you can see that in future, if you hear the word bee again, that will not only make you think of the word be, but also of the image. Or if you see the image, you'll think of the image and the word. Okay, so that's the idea, sort of dual coding. Okay, and this is how I think of it, is that it's, a double memory trace. Yeah, it's encoded twice within your memory, so it's just twice as strong. This is the issue though, isn't it, really, with just using pictures alone. Was it a B or a B or a B? So this is probably a little bit better just for, accuracy, I would say. This is less good. Yeah, putting a label far away is just really creating kind of undesirable cognitive load there for no reason. This is probably even worse. Okay, so really, I think, the idea definitely is use words and images to get that double trace, place the words near the image that you're using, and really less is more. Okay, try and think about reducing the amount of words that you need to use. So here are some examples of topics where I sort of deliberately try to apply this, and you'll see there's some examples of these on the next few slides. All right, this is my teaching of economic growth. Now, of course, students are not presented with this with one hit. Okay, in fact, they're not presented with the pictures at all. All right, this is actually some notes from my teaching about GDP, okay, and real versus nominal GDP, per capita GDP, and the difference between value and volume. And I typically present the numbers first. If you look at the top here, you've got country A and country B. Year one, country A has produced £1,000 worth of value of output. Country B, £1,000. Year two, 1,500, and country B is 2,000. All right, and it's sort of a trick question, really, isn't it, to which economy's grown the most? Because without the pictures, it looks like country B has grown the most. It looks like country B has sort of doubled in size. And then I say, well, it depends, doesn't it? Okay, if country, and then I sort of draw in the boxes, and you can see really what's happened there if you look closely, is that actually it's just an increase in the price, isn't it? Because country B has actually made more boxes. And I'm not explaining this as fully, of course, as I would in class, but then I go on to do some other pictorial representations to explain per capita GDP and the relationship between value and volume. All right, but it's these images and, not loads of words, all right, but sort of slight, simple sketching that helps me to explain the point. This is my lesson notes on quantitative easing. Again, I shall spare you the lengthy explanation of this topic, of course. It does involve a rather elaborate story about a little girl wanting to borrow some money, as you can see down here, and it gets quite detailed. But I'm able to explain quite complicated topic, particularly the relationship between bond prices and the yield, using these little pictures and these little illustrations and stories. Okay, here's another one that I quite often, certainly go to image to help me to explain is monopsony. Okay, so the idea you've got a single buyer and then many sellers. Okay, but laying it out visually like that, that's a monopsony, one buyer, many sellers. Okay, contrasting to the situation where there's a single seller and lots of buyers. So if you're many buyers buying from one person, you don't have any buying power, you don't have monopsony power in that sense. But by laying it out in this way, it then enables me to question students and get them thinking, well, what about this situation? What if there's one buyer and there's one seller? Is this still a monopsony, a single buyer? And it's not really, is it? Okay, you're not really going to have much buying power buying from a monopoly because there's going to be some countervailing, counterbalancing power. But again, the layout of the stickmen just really helps me to explain that, really quickly and easily to students. Here's another example, relative poverty. Just take a read of that for a minute. Okay, so it talks about 60% level of median income, half the population above the level, half below. It's quite, it's not really very clear, very easy to understand. Okay, if you draw an odd number of people, Okay, and you can find the median person and give them a nice round number salary. Okay, and then you take 60% of that. It's really clear then to see that anybody who is earning less than that amount is going to be classed as being in relative poverty. Okay, and when you've got that set up, you can then start to explore the concept of poverty and inequality in much more detail. So, for example, these people would not be in relative poverty because they're all above 12k. These people all would. Okay, and just sort of exploring the different potential examples. But, they're different to these people earning much, much less. All right, these people we would think of as being sort of poor in a more absolute sense, maybe. Okay, you can also explore inequality. So, you look here at the difference between the lowest income earner and the highest income earner at the extreme ends of the scale there. Just 2 out of the 7 still falling into relative poverty, but a big gap between the lowest income earner and the highest income earner. Whereas here, much smaller gap, look there, still the same relative poverty, okay, 2 people, but the gap between the lowest income earner and the highest income is much smaller. So, just trying to sort of separate apart the difference between poverty, different types of poverty, and between poverty compared to inequality. And again, I find images and that kind of visual representation much more effective in explaining that topic. Thinking about placing the labels also nearby. I'm sure you've drawn a diagram like this in your time if you teach economics. We're guilty of some of the worst sins, I think, in this respect, of putting our labels far apart. This is generally from my lesson. I have to confess my sins of, undesirable cognitive load here. That's not maybe very friendly if you're learning that for the first time, is it? Of course, it's presented gradually, step by step. I've tried to use some colour and some letters, but, it could be better. So I'm trying to work on my diagrams. I'm trying to work by putting the labels sort of more embedded in the diagram, certainly to begin with, okay, so students can see them better. And trying to label the areas. Again, technology helps you to do this. So trying to label the areas on diagrams in the place where that thing's actually happening. Now, of course, students can't use colour and they can't do that in the exam, but, the exam is way off. So it's more really about understanding the topic and reducing the cognitive load when students are learning that initially. Okay, and linked to dual coding is this sort of more wider idea of organising things graphically and thinking about as experts, the schema that we have, our mental maps, our mental imagery of topics, thinking about those, and then trying to sort of record those in a visual way for students. Now, some of the things I've done with pictures in the earlier section are of that, but you don't always need to use images. But you are trying to represent your kind of thinking, your mental organisation of a topic, in a visual way. If you've read anything from Oliver Caviglioli, you'll certainly know that he's on quite a mission at the minute to really kind of get teachers thinking a bit more widely about the graphic organisers they use and about using those more appropriately. And really, this is what it's all about. Okay, it's not all about using mind maps. He produces this excellent poster, which I strongly recommend you go and take a look at and try to have a go at applying in your practice. You can get this from his website, olliecav.com. And I found this really useful in thinking about how I lay out my content and how I describe things and communicate things in a more efficient and a more effective way graphically. I kind of have done this. I have been doing this for quite a few years now. I think of a paragraph in economics as being like a chain. And I'm sure you probably do as well. They use the word chain in some of the marking descriptors, don't they? When you look at mark schemes for exams, they talk about steps in the chain of analysis. But really getting that visual of, your paragraph has to start with one thing and it links on step by step to another thing. I use that language very early on with students, and we talk about planning essays as writing chains. Yeah, so students are, discussing with me using that language of a chain and developing up points in a step-by-step manner. This is how I'd expect them to plan in the exam, is to write the thing they're talking about, and then the step-by-step links, which diagram, which theory they're going to go via, and where they're going to end up. So certainly sort of thinking about the pathways in which their paragraphs are going to play out. Okay, so that's really sort of trying to apply that graphic organisation idea. And here's another example as well of graphic organisation of a topic. I'll just let you take a quick look at that. Okay, so this is for the topic of contestability. And of course, I would not present that as I've just presented it to you. Okay, sort of a classic sins of graphic organisers is this idea of map shock and bombarding you with information in one hit. But I'm going to use that to get over the idea of how market structure affects conduct or performance of firms, which is in the grey bit, and then how that affects market performance. And I've used this very effectively with students recently to replace a table, and I've got a blog on that if you're interested. Okay, but it's thinking about trying to make our communication more effective. Okay, so the next thing we're going to think about is spacing. I think we're probably all feeling at the minute now we could do with a bit more space. Okay, and what works well, I guess, in friend and family relationships sometimes, if you're getting on top of people in your household, also works well in learning. So taking a bit of time, a bit of space between covering a topic, okay, so between your initial coverage of that content and then the practice that students are doing on that topic is a good idea. Yeah, because it allows for a bit of forgetting to take place in the middle. Okay, so if you're teaching, just do some initial work on free market and command economies at the very beginning of your studies of economics. Maybe just wait a bit before you set students a task on that. Don't just immediately sort of teach the topic and set the essay straight away. Have a bit of a gap. Let them forget a little bit of it and then have to bring it back into their minds and think about it again and retrieve those memories again when they, before they actually come to do the practice. So, there's nothing particular to say for economics necessarily about that, but, just think about that again is a useful thing. It's something I've found is helpful. And of course, we're always in our subject revisiting topics because of the kind of foundational and building nature of topics building on one another. Okay, the next topic is interleaving. And I have to say, I did not really understand this one very well to begin with. I think it's because the word just doesn't sort of mean anything to many people initially. And it wasn't until I realised that it's got the word leave in it, okay, which is kind of coming from leaves and leaf, okay, like the leaves in a book. Okay, so you're thinking about leafing through a book, or you're thinking about, imagine a book that's got some tracing paper pages in it. Okay, it's like a leaf, isn't it? So once I sort of started to think about it like that, it made sense about mixing together different things, having different leaves, not just doing all the things the same. Okay, so that's, again, I've got a blog on this that explains this in much more detail that I'd certainly recommend you have a read, but enables students to then actually discriminate between the different content which they need for the question. So here's an example. All right, if you just teach about bees, okay, and then do questions about bees, it's obvious that, some of the answers are going to be things like black and white and buzz and honey. Okay, because you've just learned about bees, the questions are all about bees. And then if you go and teach about butterflies and then do the questions about butterflies, it's going to be about caterpillars and cocoons and, symmetrical wings and all the flying and all the rest of it, isn't it? Okay, and again, some of the answers and some of the approach to the question is going to be fairly obvious. All right, then you're going to teach about ladybirds and it's going to be about black and red and spots and all this. All right, so that would not be interleaved practice. Okay, that would be sort of massed or blocked practice. If you were to teach all three of those things, and then do some mixed up practice at the end. So your practice for students, your questions maybe, were a bee one, and then a ladybird one, and then a butterfly one, and then another butterfly one. The students are having to approach the question and apply that skill of discrimination in working out which bug this question is actually about to begin with, okay, before then actually being able to answer the question as well. So it's increasing the level of challenge. And I've found for economics the best example of a topic really where that applies is elasticity. So I tend to teach quite heavily the topic of price elasticity of demand to begin with, and then do a reasonable amount of practice on that just to get students into the gist of it. And then I teach price elasticity of supply, but I don't do any practice on it. And I don't do any practice on cross elasticity or income elasticity either. So I go through all four, okay, and then I do practice at the end. Because mixed up practice then is not only testing, can students, figure out the things for XED and YED, because that's kind of obvious if you've just done a lesson on income elasticity demand, then all the questions are about interpreting positive and negative numbers being normal or inferior goods. Whereas if you mix it up, it's more difficult. They've got to work out exactly which interpretation and exactly which type of elasticity the question is actually about. The same thing probably applies to government intervention. If you don't just teach indirect tax and then do questions on it, and teach subsidy and do questions on it. If you teach a range of interventions and you've kind of had things like tax, subsidy, minimum price, maximum price, you've mixed all these things up then. So then the questions on them require students to figure out, exactly which thing. Because students often get confused, don't they, between the areas on tax and subsidy diagrams, for example. So better to question them later on and kind of mix up that practice. A good example as well is efficiency and objectives of firms. So again, I tend to teach those topics and don't really do much practice on them, to be honest. I tend to do the practice after I've taught the two with something like this. Okay, really good, useful old spec multiple choice question from 2014 there. I'm sure some experts out there will recognise this question. But as you can see there, tests of revenue maximisation, profit maximisation, allocative efficiency, productive efficiency. You can also do a little recap about sales max while you're there. And it's in a single question, you can basically have students sort of revise all four of those. So it's a very efficient way, rather than just doing a load of questions on productive efficiency, then a load on allocative, and then a load on profit max and rev max, which it's more obvious what they're going to be at the time. Okay, so that's this idea of mixing up practice. So I certainly found that's quite effective. To do that deliberately saves time earlier on. Okay, the next one is elaboration. All right. Okay, this is all about adding details. Again, this is not something you kind of read that much about. People aren't giving loads of examples of how they're sort of engaging in elaboration, but it's about adding detail, and I think best explained using this sort of imagery. You probably recognise this diagram of the representation of schema. I think this is a bit similar to one I think on the David Didow blog, I believe. But the idea is that this kind of represents our mental map, our schema that we have, sort of things and how they're connected. But elaboration is trying, so once you've got an understanding of a topic, is trying to increase that. So trying to add links and improve the connections between different parts of a topic, and then also to improve the connections between that and other topics as well. So you're making more and more links. Okay. And I would certainly say this is kind of more difficult, more challenging. The learning scientists recommend carrying out what's called an elaborative interrogation. So when I read about this, I constructed my own version of this, which is generic and applies to any subject. And just take a quick look at the questions there. So the idea is that students would pick a topic, any topic, and then you have a go at the elaborative interrogation by answering as many of these questions as you can, and asking further how and why questions as well. Okay, so you can see there's how questions, why questions, links to life, links to the topic, and there's some comparison stuff down there as well. And I have tried this out with students. I've tried it out with some year 12 and year 13. And some people sort of, give it a really good go. I've tried it out with year 10 as well. Okay, but I tell you what, it is difficult. It's a lot of effort. So here is my go at actually doing this with indirect tax. It just looks like some scrappy notes on indirect tax, and it sort of starts off like that, I guess, where I'm sort of doing the basics about the diagram and the definition, how it works, pros and cons and stuff. And then I start asking myself questions about it. How does it work? And then I start asking more detailed how and why questions that maybe aren't in the topic. So, well, how do we collect tax? And how do we decide what we tax? And why do we shift supply? Okay, so it's sort of, just exploring and trying to develop more links and more connections. And then trying to link to other things in life, to other topics. Then I do some comparison with that and other interventions. I can see the use of it while I'm doing it, but it's not quick. Okay, it is lengthy, and it's demanding. So I would probably recommend, if you would like to engage in elaborative interrogation, that you do small chunks of it. You don't try and do a full-on elaborative interrogation. If you've got really capable and motivated A-level students particularly, I think you will be fine with them having a go at it. They'll probably do a good job of it. But yeah, for most folks, you're going to want to chunk it down a little bit, make it a bit more manageable. Do it more often in small bits, I would say. Okay, right. The last of the 6 things is concrete examples. Okay. And I think we're all about providing examples, of course. This is our bread and butter. Yeah, we have to, on a day-to-day basis, be people who are making abstract ideas concrete. All right, so we are, a lot of the concepts in economics are quite abstract ideas. We're trying to sort of explain diagrams in a way that makes sense, explain concepts that are highly theoretical with real life examples. So that's all we're saying here really, is that concrete examples are beneficial, and lots of them are beneficial. And I think related to this as well is kind of storytelling and use of analogies. 2 topics where I particularly am trying to take something quite difficult that students find to understand. So this idea of the price mechanism and the signalling, rationing, incentive functions. And I talk particularly for the signalling and incentive functions about some examples involving traffic lights and involving a kind of dashboard in with all these lights on it that represent the different markets. And I'm just trying to get students, thinking about things and making connections to things that are real, in their sort of understanding. Same with contestability. I've got a whole sort of story that involves my children and Super Nanny. Again, you can see this on my blog if you're interested. But again, it's trying to sort of bring a very abstract and quite difficult to understand concept and relate it to something that's much more tangible and much more real. And they have got a good section in the Learning Scientist book on concrete examples. But I think I possibly have learned slightly more on examples from reading about direct instruction. Okay, and I will show you some of the books that I'd recommend later on. But the Research Ed Guide to Explicit and Direct Instruction is really helpful. And it contains some information about Engelmann's ideas here around direct instruction, how we go about teaching. I'd also read Mark McCourt's Teaching for Mastery, which is a book quite heavily related to maths teaching, but not just for maths teachers, which has got some similar sorts of ideas as this. And certainly the impression I got from reading both books, you really are working here on trying to develop your explanations and trying to communicate in a kind of really faultless, perfect, sort of highly efficient way. You're always trying to give examples that are correct. You're trying to give multiple examples to illustrate precise parts of a topic. You're trying to show the boundaries of things, the extremes, in order to deliver a really high quality and accurate and efficient explanation that also works and links to topics later on without having to kind of re-explain things. And I'm sure you can see how that applies to maths, and there's some great examples in the books on that as well, but it applies to some economics topics as well. So I had a go at this with regards to the multiplier. And I'm sure if you've taught the multiplier in economics before, you've probably had some sort of go a bit like this, okay, where you've given 3 students a card and you've made one the government, you've made another the bank, and you've made another a foreign business, and then you've given somebody else maybe a little container, and you've said to them, right, you own a factory that produces robots, and I'm going to spend £20,000 in your factory, and you give them some sort of fake money of some kind of tokens or something. And then you kind of encourage them to go and spend it. You say, well, you can't spend it yet, though. First of all, you need to go and pay your tax to the government. So they go and give a few coins. And you need to go also, and maybe do you want to save any money? Are you going to spend anything abroad? So they go and give those people some money. And then you say, well, what do you want to spend it on now? Okay. And then they say, well, I'm going to spend on some chips. So then you make somebody else the chip shop owner, and then they go and do the same things. Then they're wandering around the classroom and giving somebody some. And this just goes on, and all it's really doing is getting over the very basic idea that the multiplier is all about one person's income, spending becoming somebody else's income, and a little bit about withdrawals. But what you've done, if you've done it in a simplistic way, and I've done this, is really just give them a false example, because you've said nothing about the complexities of how much is actually given, and particularly if you've written kind of fake numbers down with this on the board as well. You're communicating actually an incorrect example of how you end up explaining how the multiplier actually works. So this year I completely kind of rehashed my teaching of this topic. And I started with something I normally do towards the end. So sort of thinking about the idea of £1 and then how much you would have going in tax and spending and imports and consumption. And then putting in the decimals and then adding in the marginal propensity language and the difference between consumption and withdrawals. Okay, and once I've done that, and I had 2 boards side by side, so that's displayed on one of the boards. And then I use that to do what I might have previously done at the start, which is kind of a sort of worked example. But because I'm using the same decimals that I've shown here, the worked example that I then use is actually correct. So when I put my initial injection of £12,000, we can see the withdrawals. They're not just random amounts or incorrect amounts. They're the amounts that relate to the decimals. So every time I'm sort of taking out the proportional correct amounts of withdrawals, okay, and I can add up the additions to national income each time. So this is advantageous because it's providing students with a correct example first time round. So you're not having to kind of reteach anything or clarify anything. You just do it correct from the first time. And students understand the concept in the same way as they did with the original explanation, but it's just more efficient and actually took less time and was more effective. And then you can go on to explore some of the boundaries, like, well, what if the marginal propensity to consume or to withdraw was 0 or 1, and sort of exploring the extremes. Okay, so just some very final thoughts then from me before we wrap up. Okay, so I really would encourage you as a teacher to read. There's nothing better, I think, than engaging with the research that's out there. And I think you do need to go and read it for yourself. There's a lot out there about kind of lethal mutations, and you can sort of see my thoughts here on how I'm doing it, but that's just my interpretation having read what I've read. You're encouraged to go back to the sources and to read in the various texts I recommend, or in journal articles or papers, about the theory, from the theorists and from the writers themselves. So yeah, I really would encourage you to read. And I've got at the end of this presentation some sort of references and some reading recommendations at the very end. So stay tuned to the end for those. And then think as well. Actually just spend some time reflecting on your teaching. Why am I doing it this way? Does it actually work? Is there a better way to do this? Could I do this thing in a different order? Could I do this thing at a different time? Okay, that thinking, often it comes to you automatically as you're doing this reading, and have a go, experiment, give things a try. Sometimes they don't work, do they? But sometimes you do something and think, oh, that was a lot better. That was a lot smoother. That worked a lot better. And then you can continue to improve your practice. And do share your ideas with other people as well. I found that really beneficial. It sort of encouraged me, hopefully helps support other people as well. And it's a good way to get feedback from other people and to help them to further help you to improve. And support other people as well. Particularly on Twitter, I found people have been very, very generous and kind with their support. Many people have given me sort of help and support with some of the resources that I've created and given me ideas and tips and hints, and their time as well. People have been very generous. Certainly the excellent organiser of this event, Louise Cass, she was very patient with me as I was down a bit of a rabbit hole, investigating a chemistry graphic organiser, but she was extremely patient and tolerant in bearing with me as I kind of tried to get my head around that and to sort of do some thinking. But I think that's really nice if people can support other people, and I've certainly been grateful for that support, and I would hope to be able to offer that to other people as well. So they're the things I'd really encourage you to go forward and do. Okay, so do keep in touch. That's my details at JonesLearn UK on Twitter if you want to get in touch. And my blogs, there's lots of teaching and economics teaching blogs, and some tech ones as well. So joneslearnuk.blogspot.com is the address, and I hope to hear from you and find out about whether you've been able to apply any of these things in your own teaching as well. All right, so just stay tuned for the reading, but otherwise, thank you very much for your time. Okay, so these are definitely some of the books that I would recommend in relation to some of the research that I've applied in this talk. So that's Understanding How We Learn, Dual Coding with Teachers, Retrieval Practice, Research and Resources for Every Classroom, Teaching for Mastery, The Research Ed Guide to Explicit and Direct Instruction, and Powerful Teaching. And many of the authors here have got some new books coming out as well. So Oliver Caviglioli's book coming out soon in collaboration as well on graphic organisers, and Kate Jones has another follow-up on retrieval practice as well. And Patrice Bain also, she's done a talk for this event, so look out for her latest one as well. Okay, but there's certainly books that I would recommend you take a look at.